The snowstorm was unforgiving, blanketing everything in white and turning the streets into a desolate maze of frost and silence. Jane stepped off the late bus, the icy wind clawing at her face, but she told herself she could handle the cold. What she couldn't shake, though, was the unsettling feeling that tonight something wasn't right. Jane had never imagined she'd live alone at just 19. Moving to Wisconsin for a job had felt like a step toward independence, but it came with sacrifices: a tiny apartment in a rough neighborhood and long nights walking home from work. Winter only made things harder. The snowstorms were brutal, and tonight was no exception. As the bus hissed to a stop, Jane glanced around. The streets were nearly empty except for a man pacing on the opposite sidewalk. He was hard to see through the swirling snow, but his movements were frantic, erratic. She noticed he was holding a large jug, swinging it wildly and shouting something into the cold night air. Jane hesitated before stepping off the bus. She told herself he was probably harmless, just someone having a bad night. The moment she stepped onto the street, the cold cut through her coat like a blade. Pulling her scarf tighter, she started the familiar walk home. The snow crunched under her boots as she navigated the dimly lit streets, but then she heard it. Footsteps behind her. At first, she thought it was the wind carrying echoes of her own steps, but the sound was heavier, deliberate. She glanced back and saw him, the man with the jug, now walking in her direction. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. It's just a coincidence, she thought. She turned onto another street, her pace quickening, but the footsteps behind her grew louder. When she risked another glance, the man was closer now, his shouts more distinct. "You can't ignore me!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Jane's pulse raced. She broke into a near jog, the snow making every step an effort. Her apartment was just a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. The man's pace quickened too, his heavy boots crunching louder as he closed the distance. By the time she reached her street, panic had fully taken over. She fumbled with her keys, her frozen fingers barely able to grip them. The man was at the edge of her yard now, his voice frantic. "Open up! I live here!" he screamed, shaking the jug as if it held some kind of answer. Jane shoved the door open, slammed it shut behind her, and locked it with trembling hands. For a moment, the silence inside felt deafening, but then came the pounding. His fists hammered against the door, each thud rattling the fragile wood. Through the small window by the door, she saw him up close for the first time. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild and unrelenting. He shouted nonsense, claiming he needed to get inside, that it was his home. Just as Jane reached for her phone to call the police, she heard another voice outside. Her upstairs neighbor had come out to investigate the commotion. He shouted at the man, warning him to leave. The confrontation grew heated, but the man eventually staggered off into the snowstorm, muttering incoherently. When the police arrived, they explained something that sent a chill through Jane's already frozen body. The man used to live in her apartment. He had been evicted months ago for drug use, but had been seen wandering the area ever since, seemingly fixated on returning. The incident left Jane shaken. She began avoiding walking home alone at night and double-checked her locks obsessively. Though the man was later arrested for trespassing in another neighborhood, Jane knew she'd never forget the sound of his fists on her door or the sight of his desperate, haunting eyes peering through the snowstorm. The snowstorm was merciless, turning the highway into a slippery, desolate stretch of white. Max gripped the steering wheel tightly, his old Mustang barely cutting through the relentless wind. The headlights revealed fleeting glimpses of the road ahead, but then they caught something else. Two figures standing by the roadside, waving. Against the pit of unease growing in his stomach, Max slowed down. Helping them felt like the right thing to do. But the moment they stepped into his car, something shifted. He couldn't have known then. This decision would nearly cost him his life. Max was heading home from a friend's house, determined to beat the storm. The weather had turned faster than expected, and by now it felt like driving through a whiteout. The Mustang, with its rear-wheel drive, struggled for traction, sliding at every turn. When he saw the two figures, huddled together with snow piling around them, Max hesitated. He considered driving past. They looked out of place in the middle of nowhere, but their frantic gestures and the bitter cold convinced him otherwise. As the car rolled to a stop, the man approached first, tall and broad-shouldered, his face half hidden beneath a scarf. The woman followed closely, clutching a large bag to her chest. "Thank you so much," the man said as they climbed into the back seat, shaking snow off their coats. At first, the ride was quiet, except for the sound of the engine straining against the wind. Max tried making small talk, asking where they were heading. The woman mumbled something about getting stranded after their car broke down. The man, however, stared out the window, his silence unsettling. Max couldn't help but notice the way the man's eyes scanned the interior of the car, lingering a little too long on the dashboard and glove compartment. The woman clutched her bag so tightly that her knuckles were white. He told himself they were just cold and tired, but unease crept into his thoughts. About 10 minutes into the ride, the man broke the silence. "Pull over," he said abruptly, his voice cold and commanding. Max hesitated, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. That's when he saw the knife glinting in the man's hand. "Do it now," the man growled. The woman reached into her bag, pulling out a roll of duct tape. Her earlier nervousness had vanished, replaced by a chilling calmness. Max's heart raced as he slowed the car, pulling onto the icy shoulder. Before he could react, the man yanked open his door, dragging him out into the freezing night. Snow stung his face as the man shoved him to the ground, delivering a kick to his ribs. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the man said, his knife hovering dangerously close. They demanded Max's wallet and phone before forcing him to lie face down in the snow. He felt the sharp, searing pain of a knife slicing his side. Then they left him there, bleeding and gasping for air as they sped off in his Mustang. Hours later, Max was discovered by a passing truck driver who called for help. Barely clinging to consciousness, Max was rushed to the hospital, where doctors said the freezing temperatures had slowed his blood loss just enough to save his life. But the nightmare wasn't over. That same night, Max's family noticed his Mustang parked outside their home. The engine was running, but inside were two unfamiliar figures, one in the driver's seat and the other staring directly at the house. Max's brother, feeling something was wrong, locked the doors and flicked the porch light repeatedly. The figures eventually sped off into the storm, but the encounter left the family shaken. The police found the Mustang the next morning, crashed in a ditch. Both hitchhikers were dead, killed on impact. Investigators pieced together the story. The pair had likely used Max's registration in the glove box to find his home. Their intentions remained unclear. Were they planning to rob the house or something worse? Max eventually recovered, but the scars, both physical and emotional, stayed with him. He no longer stops for strangers on the road, no matter how desperate they look. "Sometimes," he says, "helping can put you in danger you never saw coming." It was supposed to be a quiet night. Snow blanketed the streets, and most people were staying indoors, safe from the storm. James, a pizza delivery driver, had almost made it through his shift without incident. But when he arrived at the last house of the night, the darkness surrounding the home felt different, thicker, more oppressive. He brushed off the feeling and knocked on the door. What happened next would haunt him forever. James had worked as a delivery driver for 3 years. He enjoyed the job's simplicity, though it came with occasional odd encounters. That night, the snowstorm had made driving treacherous, and business was slow. His manager had offered to send him home early, but James decided to stay and take one last delivery. The order came in late, just after 10 p.m. The address was unfamiliar, located in a secluded part of town James rarely visited. He punched it into his GPS, bundled up, and grabbed the pizza bag. As he drove, the storm grew fiercer, the snow swirling in blinding flurries. The house finally came into view, barely visible under a layer of snow. Something about the house felt wrong. It was dark, with no lights on, not even a porch light to guide him. James double-checked the address, thinking he might have made a mistake. But no, this was the place. Knocking on the door, James waited, shivering in the biting wind. After a moment, the door creaked open and a middle-aged woman peered out. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously. "Get inside!" she hissed, pulling him in before he could protest. Confused and uneasy, James tried to explain that he was just there to deliver pizza. "I didn't order a pizza," she snapped, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "He's out there." Before James could ask who, a faint tapping sound came from the window. Both froze. James turned slowly and his heart sank. A man stood outside, his face distorted into a sick grin, his breath fogging the glass. In his hand was a knife, the blade tapping rhythmically against the pane. The woman grabbed James's arm. "He's been tormenting me all night," she said. "I think he sent you here to get me to open the door." As James tried to make sense of the situation, the man disappeared from the window. Seconds later, the sound of footsteps on the porch sent chills down his spine. The door handle rattled violently, and the man's muffled voice called out, "You can't hide forever." The woman motioned for James to stay silent, but the tension was unbearable. James reached for his phone, but she stopped him. "He cut the phone line," she whispered. James and the woman crept toward the back of the house, hoping to find another way out. The man's pounding on the door grew louder, his shouts more frantic. But just as James reached the back door, it burst open. The man lunged inside, his knife raised. Pure adrenaline took over. James grabbed a chair and swung it, knocking the knife from the man's hand. The woman screamed, but James didn't stop. He shoved the intruder back out the door and slammed it shut, locking it as the man banged furiously against the wood. When the police finally arrived, they uncovered the truth. The couple had broken into the house earlier that evening, murdering the elderly owner and using it as a trap for unsuspecting visitors. James had been their latest target. Shaken, James quit his job the next day, unable to face the thought of delivering to another stranger's door. "I was lucky to walk away that night," he says. "But I'll never forget the look on his face or the sound of that knife tapping against the glass."